Put 2 fingers just below the front rim of your hip bone, where the hip meets the thigh. Press in firmly. The dense, ropey band of muscle you feel under your fingertips is your psoas major. You did not ask it to be tight. It is tight because you have been sitting, and in the roughly 12 hours your body spent folded into chairs and seats and couches today, that muscle has been quietly editing the architecture of your hips. Here is what was happening inside you, hour by hour, while you sat. Set your hand on the side of your hip and feel the bony ridge running across the upper edge of your pelvis. That is your iliac crest. Run your fingers forward and down until they catch on a sharp prominence at the front. That is your anterior superior iliac spine. 2 inches below it, and slightly inward, is where your psoas major and your iliacus tendons converge before diving down to attach to a small bump on the inside of your femur called the lesser trochanter. Together, this pair of muscles is called the iliopsoas, the single most powerful hip flexor in your body. It originates not just on the pelvis, it originates on the bodies of your lumbar vertebrae, the bones of your lower back, which means the muscle pulling your knee toward your chest is the same muscle pulling on your spine. Now move your hand to the back of your pelvis. The thick muscle bulk you feel there is your gluteus maximus, the largest muscle in your body by mass. Underneath it, deeper toward the bone, sit 2 smaller fans of tissue called the gluteus medius and the gluteus minimus. These are the muscles that hold you upright on one leg when you walk. They are the muscles that extend your hip when you stand up out of a chair. They are the engine of every step. Inside the joint itself, behind all that muscle, lies a ball and socket. The ball is the head of your femur. The socket is the acetabulum, a cup-shaped depression in your pelvis. Both surfaces are coated in a glassy white layer of hyaline cartilage, no thicker than a fingernail. This cartilage has no blood supply. None. It does not have a single capillary running through it. Surrounding the entire joint is a tough fibrous bag called the joint capsule, and inside that bag floats a small reservoir of synovial fluid, a viscous egg-white substance composed mostly of water and a long-chain molecule called hyaluronic acid. Threading past the joint are nerves and arteries the diameter of a pencil. The sciatic nerve, the largest nerve in your body, exits the pelvis behind the joint, passing under or in some people directly through a muscle called the piriformis. The femoral nerve passes in front of the joint, running through the crease where your thigh meets your torso. Beside it runs the femoral artery and the femoral vein. This is the architecture. A weight-bearing ball and socket. 2 opposing muscle groups, front and back. A reservoir of fluid that has no pump. 3 major nerves and a major blood vessel threading through narrow corridors. None of it was designed to be held at 90 degrees of flexion for 12 hours at a stretch. Now sit down. Imagine the chair. Imagine the desk, or the steering wheel, or the couch. The hour begins. Your knees rise toward your chest. Your hips bend to almost exactly 90 degrees. The psoas, the muscle you just pressed under your fingers, shortens. Its origin on your lumbar vertebrae moves closer to its insertion on the femur. The muscle is now in a slack, contracted position. It will stay that way for the duration of the sit. A muscle held in a shortened position does not simply wait passively. It adapts. Inside each muscle fiber, the contractile units are called sarcomeres, and they are arranged in long strings end to end. A muscle that is chronically lengthened adds sarcomeres. A muscle that is chronically shortened drops them. The structural protein titin, which gives muscle its elastic recoil, gets remodeled. The connective tissue scaffolding around the fibers, called fascia, becomes stiffer through the deposition of cross-linking proteins. The shortening is not metaphorical. It is structural. A cross-sectional study published by Boukabache and colleagues in the journal Musculoskeletal Science and Practice in 2021 used a modified version of the Thomas test to measure passive hip extension in adults across a range of sitting and activity levels. People who sat the most and moved the least had measurably shorter, stiffer hip flexors. The relationship was dose-dependent. More sitting meant less hip extension. Less hip extension meant a body that could no longer reach the position it was designed to hold while standing upright. A more recent intervention study, published by Brent Erisman and B.J. Lehecka in the International Journal of Sports Physical Therapy in 2025, demonstrated that a simple daily lunge and reach stretch could restore hip flexor length and improve gluteal function within weeks. The reverse is also true. A daily routine of sitting can take it away within weeks. Here is the consequence. When you finally stand up, the psoas does not release. Your spine pays the bill. The psoas attaches up the front of your lumbar vertebrae. When that muscle is shortened and you try to stand straight, it pulls your lumbar spine forward into the position called anterior pelvic tilt. Your lower back arches. Your belly drifts forward. Your weight transfers off the front of the pelvis and onto the back of the lumbar vertebrae, where the small facet joints take loads they were not built to take. The mild ache you feel in your lower back after a long flight or after a long workday is not a back problem. It is a hip problem referred upward by a muscle that forgot how to relax. The same shortening that is rewriting the geometry of your spine is also in the same instant sending an inhibitory signal across the joint to the muscles directly behind it. Anatomists and neurologists have known for a long time that opposing muscle groups around a joint communicate through the spinal cord by a reflex called reciprocal inhibition. When one muscle contracts, an inhibitory signal travels into the spinal cord and dampens the firing rate of the muscle on the other side. This is why your bicep does not fight your tricep when you straighten your arm. The system is elegant. The system is also being misused. When the psoas is held in chronic contraction for hours, it sends a sustained inhibitory current to its antagonist. The antagonist of the psoas is the gluteus maximus. So while you sit, the largest muscle in your body is being told, neurologically, to stay quiet. This is the phenomenon that Vladimir Janda, the Czech neurologist who pioneered the study of postural muscle patterns in the mid-20th century, first described in patients with chronic low back pain. He noticed that nearly all of them had glutes that did not fire on demand. Decades later, Stuart McGill at the University of Waterloo gave the pattern a popular name. He called it gluteal amnesia. In a 2013 study, McGill and his team measured glute activation during a bridge exercise, then induced acute hip joint pain with a clinical procedure, and remeasured. The glute on the painful side fired with significantly less force, immediately. The brain had pulled its signal back from a muscle that was, by every other measure, perfectly healthy. Your glutes are not asleep. They are not weak in the simple sense. They have been issued a different instruction by your nervous system. The instruction says, do less. When the body's primary hip extensor goes quiet, the work does not disappear. It gets reassigned. The hamstrings, smaller muscles that cross two joints, take over hip extension during walking. The lumbar erector spinae, the muscles running up either side of your spine, take over what should have been a glute job. The result is the pattern McGill described in his clinical work. The pattern that takes the largest muscle in the body and replaces it with 3 or 4 smaller ones doing overtime. This is why a long walk on flat pavement after a long day of sitting can produce a deep ache in the lower back rather than a healthy fatigue in the buttocks. Your body is moving with the wrong engine. While the muscles forget how to fire, the joint at the center of all of this is starting to go hungry. The same prolonged flexion that quiets the glutes also stops the ball of your femur from rocking inside its socket. And the moment the rocking stops, a quieter and more consequential process stops with it. Cartilage, as I said earlier, has no blood supply. Not even microscopic capillaries. It survives by a different mechanism entirely. The cartilage cells, called chondrocytes, are nourished by diffusion of nutrients from the synovial fluid surrounding them. But that fluid has no pump. It cannot circulate by itself. It depends on you. Every time the ball of your femur compresses against the cartilage on one side of the socket, fluid is squeezed out of the cartilage matrix the way liquid is squeezed from a sponge. When the load shifts to the other side, the squeezed region expands and draws fresh fluid back in. This alternating cycle of compression and decompression is the only mechanism by which nutrients reach the cartilage cells and waste products leave them. When you sit, The hip joint is loaded at a single angle for hours. The same patch of cartilage is bearing the same pressure. There is no rocking. There is no sponging. The chondrocytes deeper in the cartilage are receiving less oxygen, less glucose, fewer amino acids, and clearing less of their own waste than they would during a single minute of walking. The synovial fluid itself is being neglected. The synovial membrane, the inner lining of the joint capsule, produces fluid in response to joint motion. Movement is the signal. Stillness is the absence of the signal. After hours of sitting, the fluid that remains in the joint is less freshly secreted, more depleted, more viscous in some regions, and less viscous in others. The molecular structure of hyaluronic acid, which gives healthy joint fluid its slippery character, degrades over time when it is not being replenished by the membrane. The morning stiffness when you stand up after a long sit is not psychological. It is not exaggeration. It is the literal sound of a joint trying to redistribute lubricant that should have been redistributing itself for the past 6 hours. The first dozen steps you take are not a warm-up in the muscular sense. They are the joint reopening lines of supply. Imagine now that the chair is not a one-time event. It is your Monday and your Tuesday and your Wednesday and every weekday for the past 30 years. The same patch of cartilage on the femoral head has been compressed against the same patch of cartilage on the acetabular rim for 8 hours a day, every working day, for 3 decades. The chondrocytes in that region have lived under conditions of metabolic deprivation for cumulative years. They have produced less collagen. They have produced less of the proteoglycans that hold the cartilage matrix together. The cartilage layer over that region is thinner, more brittle, slower to repair microscopic damage. This is not yet osteoarthritis, but it is the soil in which osteoarthritis grows. The static joint is one consequence of inactivity. A more systemic alarm is sounding through your bloodstream at the same time. Mark Hamilton, then at the University of Missouri and now at the University of Houston, spent the better part of his career documenting what happens to muscle metabolism when ambulatory activity is withdrawn. In a study published in the Journal of Physiology in 2003 with his colleague Bay, and again in the Journal of Applied Physiology in 2006 with Derrick, Hamilton showed that the activity of an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase falls by 90 to 95% in skeletal muscle within hours of inactivity. 95%. Not a moderate reduction, not a percentage shift, a near total collapse. Lipoprotein lipase, abbreviated as LPL, is the enzyme anchored to the inside of your capillary walls that breaks apart the triglyceride-rich lipoproteins circulating in your blood. It is the molecular gateway through which the fat in your bloodstream is pulled into muscle cells and burned for energy. Without it, triglycerides circulate longer. HDL cholesterol drops. Insulin sensitivity in the local tissue declines. The biochemical environment of your bloodstream shifts in the direction associated with cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. The collapse of LPL activity is not triggered by what you ate. It is not triggered by your genetics. It is triggered by the local absence of contractile activity in your postural muscles. The muscles around your hips, your thighs, and your calves are constantly performing small contractions when you stand, walk, or even fidget. Those contractions are the signal that maintains LPL gene expression in the surrounding capillaries. Take the contractions away. The signal goes quiet. The enzyme follows. Here is what Hamilton's research made impossible to deny. The effect is independent of formal exercise. You can sit for 10 hours, then run for an hour, and the running does not undo what the sitting did to your local capillary chemistry. The hip and thigh muscles that just ran will recover their LPL activity for a few hours after the run. Then, the moment you sit again, the suppression returns within 60 to 90 minutes. This is why epidemiologists began publishing data in the early 2000s showing that people who sat the most had higher rates of cardiovascular disease even when they met all standard exercise guidelines. James Levine, the endocrinologist at the Mayo Clinic, who coined the term non-exercise activity thermogenesis to describe the calories burned through everyday standing, walking, and fidgeting, demonstrated that two adults of the same body size can differ in daily energy expenditure by as much as 2,000 kilocalories, purely on the basis of how much they move outside of dedicated exercise. The chair sitter and the pacer eat the same lunch and go to bed in very different bodies. The hip, in other words, is not just a joint. It is a metabolic organ, and when it goes still, the chemistry of your bloodstream shifts. While the chemistry shifts, the nerves and vessels crossing this region are bearing weight they were never engineered to bear. When you sit, the entire mass of your upper body transfers down through two bony prominences at the bottom of your pelvis called the ischial tuberosities. The sit bones, they sit directly above the deep gluteal space, the region where the sciatic nerve emerges from the pelvis on its way down the back of the thigh. In about 85% of people, the sciatic nerve passes underneath the piriformis muscle. In the remaining fraction, it pierces directly through the muscle's belly. Either way, when you sit on a hard chair for an hour, the muscles and connective tissues of the deep gluteal space are compressed between bone above and chair below, and the sciatic nerve is part of that sandwich. This is why the foot falls asleep. This is why one leg feels tingly when you finally stand. This is the mechanical interruption of axonal transport along the nerve. Brief and reversible in most cases. Chronic and contributory in others. In front of the joint, in the inguinal crease where your thigh meets your torso, the femoral nerve, the femoral artery, and the femoral vein all pass through a narrow tunnel of connective tissue. When you sit, that tunnel is folded shut at an acute angle. The femoral vein, which has thin walls and depends on the surrounding muscle contraction to push blood back toward the heart, is partially compressed. The venous return from your lower leg slows. Blood pools in the calf. Fluid leaks from the capillaries into the surrounding tissue. The legs feel heavy. The ankles swell. This is the same physiological cascade that produces deep vein thrombosis during long-haul flights. The flights are not the cause. The seated posture is the cause. The flights are simply prolonged versions of what your office chair is doing every weekday, at lower intensity, over years. So now you have the cascade. The psoas tightens. The glutes go quiet. The cartilage starves. The capillary enzymes switch off. The nerves and veins get pressed against bone. 5 mechanisms running simultaneously, in the same region, triggered by the same input. 12 hours in a chair. This is the point in the script where I want to pause and tell you exactly how confident to be in each of those claims, because not all of them are evidenced with the same rigor. The shortening of the hip flexor with prolonged sitting is established beyond reasonable dispute. The cross-sectional data from Boukabache and colleagues, the intervention data from the Eresman and Laheka group, and decades of clinical observation by physical therapists and physiatrists converge on the same finding. The mechanism is consistent with what we know about sarcomere adaptation. Place this claim in the highest tier of confidence. The collapse of lipoprotein lipase activity with muscular inactivity is also in the highest tier. Hamilton's laboratory has replicated this finding across multiple species, multiple muscle groups, and multiple experimental protocols. The molecular pathway is mapped. The enzyme can be measured. The effect is robust. The cartilage and synovial fluid mechanism is well established at the level of basic physiology. Animal studies, including a careful series of nutrition deprivation experiments published in 2013, have shown that depriving cartilage of synovial fluid circulation produces measurable degradation. The link between specific human sitting hours and specific human cartilage degradation is harder to measure directly. The physiology is consistent. The direct causal chain to clinical osteoarthritis is partially inferred. The gluteal inhibition story is real, but the terminology has been disputed. McGill's measurements of reduced glute activation are reproducible. The neurological mechanism of reciprocal inhibition is textbook. Whether to call the result amnesia, inhibition, or simply altered motor recruitment is a question of language. The underlying physiology stands. Place this claim in the strong but debated tier. The nerve and vascular compression story is mechanistically clear at the level of basic anatomy. Anyone who has felt a leg fall asleep on a long drive has experienced the phenomenon firsthand. The long-term contribution of chronic, low-grade compression to neurological symptoms is less precisely quantified. Place this claim in the consistent but partially inferential tier. What I will not tell you is that 12 hours of sitting today guarantees a hip replacement at 65. That claim is not what the data supports. What the data does support is that the longer you sit, on average, across years, the higher your risk of musculoskeletal pain, metabolic dysfunction, and degenerative joint changes that ultimately lead to interventions. The relationship is statistical. The trajectory is not destiny. The body is plastic. Within weeks of changing the input, measurable parameters change. Now we get to the harder part of the conversation. If your hip becomes painful enough that you seek medical care, somewhere along your treatment path you will likely be offered a substance called hyaluronic acid in the form of an intra-articular injection. The trade names are Synvisc, Orthovisc, Euflexa, Hyalgan, and a few others. The procedure is called viscosupplementation. A clinician injects a syringe of high molecular weight hyaluronic acid directly into your hip joint capsule. A single injection or a short series costs hundreds to over $1,000 in the United States. The hyaluronic acid is concentrated, sterile, and uniformly distributed across the joint surface. For a period of weeks to months, the lubricating properties of your synovial fluid improve, and your pain decreases. If your hip degenerates further, you will be offered a total hip arthroplasty. A surgical team will remove the head of your femur, remount your acetabulum, and replace both surfaces with metal and ceramic and polyethylene. The procedure costs, on average in the United States, somewhere between $40,000 and $70,000 depending on the facility and the implant. Roughly 450,000 of these surgeries are performed each year in the United States alone, and that number is projected to exceed 650,000 annually by the end of this decade. Here is what I want you to hold next to that fact. The hyaluronic acid in those injection syringes is the same molecule, chemically, that your synovial membrane secretes for free into your hip joint every day of your life. The pharmaceutical version is more concentrated, more pure, more reliably distributed, and delivered into a joint that has often already lost the capacity to maintain its own lubrication. That is why it exists. That is why it works in cases of advanced osteoarthritis. The honest reality is that in a degraded joint, the body's own production is no longer sufficient, and a supplemental dose is the kind of intervention modern medicine is designed to provide. But in a healthy joint, your body produces its own hyaluronic acid. It does so on a dosing schedule determined entirely by movement. A standing minute is a dose. A walking minute is a dose. A squatting minute is a higher dose. A minute of climbing stairs is an even higher dose. A sitting minute is the absence of the dose. You are not paying for the molecule when you pay for a viscosupplementation injection. You are paying for what your joint can no longer make in sufficient quantity because the production system was not used. The same logic applies to lipoprotein lipase, and here the price tag is larger and quieter. The statin drugs prescribed to reduce cardiovascular risk address one piece of the lipid puzzle, but they cannot restore the LPL activity that physical inactivity has suppressed. They are not designed to. The contractile signal in your postural muscles is what restores LPL. Movement is the medicine. There is no patent on it. No clinical trial recruits subjects. No insurance code reimburses it. This is not an argument that medication is unnecessary. People in pain require pain relief. People with advanced joint disease require joints that work. The pharmaceutical and surgical interventions exist because the underlying physiology has progressed past the point where lifestyle alone is sufficient. The honesty I want to offer you is that for most people, for most of life, the pathway runs in the other direction. The dose schedule of movement is what determines whether you arrive at the pharmaceutical and surgical endpoint at all. So now go back to your fingers, 2 inches below the front rim of your hip bone where you started. Stand up. Press the same spot again. Then take 3 steps forward. Stop. Press it again. Feel what changed. The dense, ropey band has softened. The fibers have shifted. The muscle that was held short for the last hour is, even after only 3 steps, no longer in the same shortened state. Your glutes fired. Your femur rocked inside its socket. Your cartilage compressed and decompressed and drew a fresh draft of synovial fluid into its matrix. Your capillary LPL received its signal. Your femoral vein opened back up. The same 5 mechanisms that ran in one direction for the past hour reversed in 3 steps. The old country doctor your grandfather visited, the one who saw farmers and bakers and dock workers and lived to see his patients live into their 90s without hip replacements, had a single piece of advice that he gave to everyone. Get up. Walk a little. Sit down. Get up again. He did not know about lipoprotein lipase. He did not know about chondrocyte metabolism. He did not know about sarcomere counts in the iliopsoas, or reciprocal inhibition of the gluteus maximus, or the molecular weight of hyaluronic acid. He knew that the people who moved through their day in small, frequent bouts stayed well. He knew that the people who sat for hours on end got stiff, then sore, then crippled. The medicine was the same then as it is now. Stand up every hour. Walk a little. Bend at the hip. Squat once or twice. Climb a flight of stairs if there is one. Not at the gym. After. Inside the hours of your sitting, threaded through them, 1 minute at a time. The dose is not the workout. The dose is the interruption. 12 hours of sitting did something to your hips today. 12 hours interrupted by 12 standing minutes would have done something very different. The architecture inside you responds to the input you give it on a time scale of hours, not years. You owe your joints nothing. They will keep doing their work as long as you give them the signal. The signal is movement. The dose is the rest of your life. Stand up. Press the spot. Tell me what happened when you took the 3 steps. Was it your psoas that spoke first, or your glutes, or your lower back?